Okay, well, complex adaptive leadership can really be seen at two levels. The first level is that it's a way of looking at leadership which is complementary to the traditional view of leadership. The traditional view of leadership sees leadership in a sort of like a hierarchy, which is leadership of the many by the few. And it's an oligarchical view, if you like, or an oligarchy view of leadership. Complex adaptive leadership is a complementary view, and what that sees leadership is, it sees leadership as, if you like, a dynamic which involves all of the individuals and is not necessarily vested in any one place in the organization. So it sees leadership beyond being a role and beyond being, if you like, an attribute. The second way of looking at it is at the individual level, because the fact of the matter remains that most organizations have hierarchy. So what complex adaptive leadership does is it brings to the organization and to the hierarchy a different way of looking at leadership, which means you can achieve a lot more for a lot less effort. What inspired me to get into this area of looking at leadership was my experience from the military and understanding that the hierarchical approach is not always the best way, if you like, to run an operation. And what you need is initiative at every level, especially leadership at the lowest possible level of any organization. I got into leadership development and strategy consulting and realized that there was a real need to take this sort of thinking into business and into organizations. Before I got into complexity science and chaos theory, I used the humanistic work of Mary Parker Follett to, if you like, position what I was saying, and talked about empowerment and talked about engaging employees. And, generally speaking, the HR people loved it. The operational people more or less got it. But, the technical people, the engineers, it was just like talking double Dutch. And I thought to myself, if this is a real good way of looking at leadership, there has to be a scientific and mathematical view of looking at this. And that's when I stumbled across James Gleick's work on chaos about 20 years ago. And ever since then, I've been using chaos theory and complexity theory to help leaders take a different view of leadership and also have that encouragement to let go and to allow complexity to work for the organization rather than trying to control everything and end up having complexity working against the organization. Complexity is affecting organizations and executives more and more. And the reason for that today is things are much more interlinked. Therefore, cause and effect becomes blurred, and it's very, very difficult to predict. Therefore, the old ways of formulating strategies, having people at the top analyzing, coming up with a strategy and implementing at the lower levels, by the time the strategy is formulated, the context has changed and it's almost out of date. And so there's a huge degree of frustration. In the old days, they turned to God. Today they turn to McKinsey. The fact of the matter is complexity now is affecting us all far more than it has before, and that is because of the advances of technology, which makes things much more interlinked. So a recent study from IBM last year interviewed 1,500 chief executives around the world to ask them what they thought the key issues were in managing an organization strategically. And it was no surprise to me when that report was published that the key issue was complexity. What was interesting is that those chief executives, or 70% of them, felt that their executives were poorly placed to deal with it. And that's why it's important to start taking complexity science and complexity thinking into organizations to enable those executives to deal with complexity in a far more effective way. Polyarchy works better in a complex environment because what it allows the different individuals within that complex environment to interact and take the lead and come up with necessary solutions, which can happen far faster than if you try to do that in an oligarchical way. Essentially what polyarchy means is every individual within a particular situation coming up with a solution and coming up with their initiative to help solve the issues that they're collectively facing. That can happen in a far faster way using polyarchy than oligarchy. There are lots of examples of polyarchy being put to use. For example, in the shared space approach of managing pedestrians within a highly congested area of traffic, on Kensington High Street, they had a lot of barriers and a lot of controls trying to control how the traffic moved and how the pedestrians interacted with traffic. They decided to adopt the shared space approach, which came from Holland. They removed the barriers, they even put a cycle park in the middle of the road, and the incidence of injury fell by 40%. This encouraged the Borough Council concerned to go one step further. So in Exhibition Road, what they did is they removed all traffic markings, they even removed the pavements, and they have a shared space approach. And again, you'll see traffic and pedestrians interacting in a far more effective way, and also a safer way, which is sort of kind of counterintuitive, because we feel in order for things to be achieved, they have to be controlled. And what Hierarchies suggests is actually in a complex environment which is moving and fast moving, the less controls you have, the better result you get. You're absolutely right. It is a bit scary, but it's not about relinquishing control, although that's the way it may look like it. What you do is you put things in place so that control can become self-control and self-organization. And the way you do that is you have 8 key principles in place, which are described pretty fully in my book, but in outline, these principles fall into sort of 2 camps. They're hard principles and some soft principles. Each of these principles are tensioned. So on the one hand, you have a very soft, implicit purpose, tensioned against everybody have very hard individual objectives. These things are very important to enable people to take initiative for their own objective so they can move ahead. The second pair of principles is having very clear boundaries on the one hand, but also freedom to act on the other. So if people know where their boundaries are, they can move and take freedom and take discretion in how they go about achieving their own objectives. The third pair of principles is having a high degree of tolerance to ambiguity and uncertainty, but at the same time having some very, very clear measures. So if you have these clear measures in place, individuals can see how far they are from their objective and what they need to do to adapt, but at the same time there's a high degree of uncertainty as well. And the final pair is to do with relying on a few simple rules, and this is what complexity science tells us. So underneath complexity, there are a few simple rules operating. And if you have a few simple rules in place on the one hand, you can then also rely on people's skill and will on the other hand to get on. So those are the 8 principles: purpose, objectives, measurement against ambiguity, for a tolerance for ambiguity, having clear boundaries but also freedom to act, and finally having a few simple rules but also depending on people's innate skill and will to get on with the work. If you have those things in place, then leaders can let go and they can enable people to get on with the work without them having to do much effort. In my experience, it's not too difficult, for the simple reason is I think most people realize today that the old deterministic approach to management, of people at the top knowing what to do, everybody following orders, there being a huge degree of clarity, I think people realize that those days have gone. So it's not too difficult to get people to understand that ambiguity and uncertainty is here to stay. I think it's a little harder to get people comfortable with that, but I think the way you achieve that is allow these principles to be put in place and allow success to be demonstrated. And once you've got success that's demonstrated, and actually, yes, it looks chaotic, but actually it works, people gain a lot more comfort with that ambiguity and accept it as part of a natural process. So I guess the fastest way to answer your question is through experience and with some quick wins and some success by taking a slightly different approach. There are some real-world examples where this approach has been used successfully in business. And there are 2 ways of looking at this. One way is to look at some past examples of success within complex environments, and then seeing what principles were in place. And in fact, that's how our research came up with those principles in the first place. So an example for that would be, for example, the Boeing 777 project. That was a highly complex project, and in fact it was so complex when they actually started working on it, the idea of a twin-engine transatlantic passenger plane was illegal, because at that stage of their project you had to have 4 engines and they wanted to have 2. So there's a huge degree of complexity with the regulators, with the customers, with the airlines, with the suppliers, with the designers, and the way they overcame that is to take a much more adaptive approach and a much more inclusive approach in managing that project. So there was an example of a highly complex project using these principles to good effect. Another example is, if you like, the startup by Philips, who wanted to come up with a clockless chip. Now, a clockless chip is a highly sophisticated chip which has no clock speed in terms of limits to the clock speed, and it doesn't need power. The CEO who put that into place and who set up the company and enabled the company to deliver the clockless chip actually put in place the theory of complexity science and chaos into the organization to enable the organization to achieve, which they did do far beyond the original budget and the original timeline.